The cold bit through wool and skin alike. Elara Vance stood in snow up to her knees, her breath forming white clouds in the morning air, her fingers wrapped around the grip of a Colt peacemaker that felt heavier than iron, heavier than guilt, heavier than the 6 months of lies that had brought her to this frozen ridge at the edge of the world. 7 days. She had been on this mountain for 7 days. The man standing 10 paces behind her said nothing. He never said much. Tobias Thorne was a monument of silence, a scarred tower of flannel and fur, watching her with eyes that had seen too much death to be surprised by one more fool with a gun. "Again," he said. Just that. One word like a stone dropped into still water. Elara raised the revolver. Her target was a pine cone balanced on a stump 40 yards downslope. The wind pushed against her, testing her stance. She had learned in these 7 days that the mountain tested everything: your strength, your resolve, your reasons for being alive. She squeezed the trigger. The gunshot cracked across the valley, and the pine cone exploded into fragments. A perfect hit, her 4th in a row. Behind her, Tobias grunted. It might have been approval. It might have been nothing at all. Elara lowered the gun, feeling the ache in her shoulders, the trembling in her wrists. She was not built for this. She was built for church socials and Sunday dinners, for mending clothes and baking bread, for the small domesticated life of a girl in a frontier town where women were meant to be seen and rarely heard. But that life had ended the day her father died. No, earlier than that. It had ended the day she found the letter. The memory rose unbidden, sharp as the wind. 6 months ago, late summer. The funeral had been 3 days past, and Granite Hollow had already moved on the way. Small towns do, filing away grief like old receipts, clearing space for the next tragedy. Elara had returned to her father's study to sort through his papers to make sense of the debts he had left behind. The claims on land he no longer owned, the life he no longer lived. She had found the letter tucked inside a hollowed-out copy of Blackstone's commentaries wrapped in oilcloth sealed with wax. Her father's handwriting, unmistakable. "To my daughter," it began, "if you are reading this, I am gone." Her hands had shaken so violently she nearly dropped it. "Trust no one in Granite Hollow. When the snow comes, find Tobias Thorne on Dead Man's Ridge. He will know what to do. The ledger holds the truth. Burn this after reading. Your loving father, Henry Vance." She had not burned it. She had memorized every word, every loop of ink, every tremor in the pen strokes that suggested her father had written this in fear, in haste, in the terrible certainty that he would not live to explain himself. Trust no one. She had tested that instruction carefully over the following months. She had watched. She had listened. She had played the role of the grieving daughter with a competence that surprised her, smiling at condolences, nodding at advice, accepting casseroles from women who whispered about poor dear Elara all alone now. No mother, no father, just that dreadful uncle who drank too much and smiled too little. Jedediah Crouch, mayor, landowner, her father's brother by marriage. The man who had appeared at the funeral in a suit too fine for genuine mourning, who had patted her hand and promised to take care of everything, who had moved into her father's house within a week and begun selling off pieces of Henry Vance's life, like a merchant liquidating damaged goods. She had watched Jedediah claim the livery stable, the water rights to the lower creek, the surveying maps her father had kept locked in a safe. She had watched Billy Miller, her childhood friend, suddenly start wearing new boots and carrying a rifle he could not have afforded on a deputy's son's allowance. She had listened to the whispers about gold, always gold, rumors that Henry Vance had found a vein on his property, that he had died before he could file the claim, that the land was worth a fortune if someone could just get the paperwork sorted. And she had remembered her father's words, "The ledger holds the truth." What ledger where she had torn apart the house looking for it? Nothing. She had searched the livery, the office, every place her father had worked. Nothing. Until she understood. The ledger was not in Granite Hollow. It was on the mountain, with Tobias Thorne, the man they called the Blood Hunter, the man her father had trusted with his final secret. Getting to the mountain had required a different kind of courage. Jedediah had plans for her. He had made that clear over dinner one October evening, his mustache glistening with gravy, his small eyes assessing her, the way a man assesses livestock. "You are 18 now," he had said. "A woman grown. You need a husband, someone to provide for you." He had already selected the candidate. Wallace Kern, a merchant from Cheyenne, twice widowed 60 if he was a day, with hands that shook and breath that reeked of medicinal whiskey. A business associate of Jedediah's. A man who owed favors. "He has agreed to marry you," Jedediah had announced, as if her consent were a formality. "The ceremony will be in December, before Christmas. A fresh start for the new year." She had smiled. She had thanked him. She had played her role. And she had begun to plan. The night before the wedding she had packed a small rucksack, a change of clothes, her mother's Bible, a hunting knife stolen from Jedediah's study, the letter from her father tucked against her heart. The town had been asleep when she slipped out of the house. The December wind had been a living thing, clawing at her cloak, shrieking warnings. The snow had started to fall as she reached the edge of town, thick and fast, the kind of storm that buried tracks and erased mistakes. She had walked into it willingly. The journey up Dead Man's Ridge had nearly killed her. She had no horse, no guide, only a rough idea of direction gleaned from maps in her father's study. The storm had swallowed the world. Visibility had been measured in feet, then inches. The cold had stopped being cold and started being a presence, a hand squeezing her chest, stealing her breath, whispering in her ear that she should stop just for a moment, just rest, just close her eyes. She had kept walking. When she reached the trail marker, an ancient pine wrapped with a faded red ribbon. She had collapsed against it, her legs giving out her vision, tunneling to a pinprick of white on white on white. She had thought she would die there. Instead, she had heard the crunch of boots in snow. The shape that emerged from the storm was massive, wrapped in bear fur face, hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat and scarf. A rifle on his back, a knife at his hip, Tobias Thorne. He had looked down at her for a long moment, saying nothing. Then he had bent, scooped her up as easily as if she were made of straw, and carried her up the mountain. She had expected death. She had prepared for it. What she had not prepared for was warmth, for the weight of blankets, for the smell of pine smoke and coffee, for waking up in a bed that was not hers, in a cabin built from logs thick as a man's torso, with a fire roaring and a stone hearth big enough to stand in. She had woken with her hands bound, not tightly, not cruelly, just enough to keep her from running or reaching for a weapon, a precaution. Tobias had been sitting in a rocking chair by the fire, whittling something from a piece of wood, his face partially visible now that the scarf was gone, the scar that ran from temple to cheekbone, the dark beard shot through with gray, the eyes that watched her with the patience of a man who had learned to wait. "Water," she had croaked. He had poured a tin cup from a pitcher and brought it to her, holding it to her lips while she drank. Then he had returned to his chair and resumed whittling. 3 days had passed like that. He fed her, stew thick with venison and root vegetables, bread that tasted of honey, coffee so strong it made her teeth ache. He tended the fire. He came and went, attending to chores she could hear but not see, splitting wood, checking traps, repairing something on the roof that creaked in the wind. He did not speak. She tried at first. She asked questions. Where was she? Why had he saved her? Did he know her father? Could he please untie her hands? He answered none of them. He simply studied her with those dark, unreadable eyes, then looked away. On the second day, she stopped asking. On the third day, she began to understand. He was waiting, testing her, seeing if she would break, if she would beg, if she would reveal herself to be something other than what she appeared. So she waited too. She watched him instead, the economy of his movements, the way he sharpened his knife with slow, deliberate strokes, the way he checked the door and windows before settling in for the night, always positioning himself between her and any potential threat, protecting her even as he held her prisoner. On the third night, she began to sing. It was not a conscious decision. It was simply something that rose in her unbidden, a melody her mother had taught her when Alara was small before sickness had taken her. A Shoshone song, wordless and haunting, a lullaby about stars and the river and the long journey home. Her mother had been Shoshone. Her father had rarely spoken of it, and the town had preferred to forget. But Ilara remembered. The way her mother's hair had smelled of sage. The patterns she had beaded into leather. The songs she had sung in a language Ilara had never fully learned. The melody filled the cabin soft and low. Tobias stopped whittling. His hand froze mid-stroke, the knife blade catching the firelight. He looked up at her, and for the first time she saw something crack in that stone face. Recognition, pain, memory. "Where did you learn that?" His voice was gravel and rust. "My mother taught me." "Your mother?" Aida Running Deer, before she married my father." Tobias set down the knife. He leaned forward in the rocking chair, his elbows on his knees, his eyes locked on hers. "Henry Vance's wife." "Yes?" A long silence. The fire crackled. Wind howled outside, battering the cabin walls. "Untie her," Tobias said, though there was no one else in the room. He was giving himself permission. He crossed to the bed and loosened the ropes around her wrists. She rubbed the marks, watching him waiting. "You came here on purpose," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." "Why?" She reached inside her dress and pulled out the letter, now creased and soft from being carried close to her heart. She handed it to him. Tobias read it by firelight, his jaw working his scar stark against his skin. When he finished, he folded it carefully and gave it back. "He told you to find me." "He did." "Did he tell you what I am?" "The town says you are a monster." "And you believe them?" Ilara observed the cabin around her. The shelves of preserved food neatly labeled, the books on a rough-hewn shelf, the care with which this place had been built and maintained, the gentleness with which he had fed her, tended her even while keeping her bound. "No," she said, "I do not believe them." Tobias stood abruptly and walked to the far wall where a heavy tapestry hung faded and moth-eaten. He pulled it aside to reveal an iron door set into the stone of the chimney breast. "Then come," he said. "Your father wanted you to see this." The map room was small and cold, smelling of gun oil and old paper. The walls were covered in maps of the Wyoming Territory, marked with red ink lines connecting towns to mines, mines to rivers, rivers to graves. In the center stood a desk, and on the desk lay a ledger bound in black leather. Tobias gestured to it. "Read." Ilara opened the cover. The handwriting inside was precise, almost military. Each page was a record, a name, a crime, a status. September 1884. Target Quentin Blacktooth Avery. Crime murder of the Liu family, including 3 children under the age of 10. Status eliminated. Body delivered to Federal Marshal in Laramie. January 1885. Target Sheriff Brolin. Crime extortion rape of 6 women, conspiracy to murder witnesses. Status eliminated. Evidence provided to Territorial Governor. Page after page. Outlaws, corrupt officials. Men who had slipped through the cracks of frontier justice, who had bought their way out of trials, who had laughed at the law. Men who had been hunted. And then, near the end, 2 entries that made her breath catch. April 1889. Target Ezekiel Pike. Crime hired killer murdered Henry Vance on orders of Jedediah Crouch. Status eliminated. Confession extracted and witnessed before death. June 1889. Target Jedediah Crouch. Crime embezzlement conspiracy to murder Henry Vance trafficking. Status pending. She looked up at Tobias. Trafficking. He pointed to another entry earlier in the ledger. November 1871. Target midwife Constance Hale. Crime murder for hire poisoning of Aida. Running Deer Vance during childbirth hired by Jedediah Crouch. Status eliminated. Deathbed confession obtained. The room tilted. Ilara gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles white. "My mother," she whispered. "She did not die in childbirth." "No," Tobias said quietly. "She was murdered. The midwife poisoned her with nightshade, mixed into a birthing tonic. Your mother discovered gold on her land she had inherited through her sister. She refused to sell to Jedediah, so he made sure she would never have the chance to file the claim. But I lived. How did I live if she was poisoned? The dose was meant to kill slowly, to look like complications. Your father suspected, but he had no proof. The midwife left town before he could question her. It took me 15 years to find her. She was dying of consumption In a brothel in Deadwood, she confessed everything before she went. Elara sank into a chair, the weight of it crushing her. Her mother, murdered. Her father, murdered, both for gold, both by the man who had raised her after they were gone. Why did my father not tell me? Tobias pulled a stool over and sat across from her, his massive frame somehow gentle in the lamplight. He tried. But some truths are too dangerous for children. Jedediah was watching. If you had known, if you had acted on it, he would have killed you too. Henry was protecting you. He spent years gathering evidence, building a case. He was going to take it to the federal marshal in Cheyenne, but Jedediah found out, so he hired Pike. And you killed Pike. I did. Why? Why do you do this, Huntmen? Keep ledgers. Tobias stood and walked to a shelf. He took down a small wooden frame and handed it to her. It was a photograph, faded sepia, a woman with kind eyes and dark hair, a little girl perhaps 3 years old with ribbons in her hair and a gap-toothed smile. My wife, my daughter, Sarah and May. Elara watched the faces, then at Tobias, seeing the weight of them in every line of his face. What happened to them? The same thing that happened to your mother, men with greed in their hearts and money in their pockets. A mining syndicate wanted this land. I refused to sell, so they waited until I went to town for supplies. They burned the cabin with Sarah and May inside. His voice was flat, emotionless, but his hands quivered. I hunted the men who gave the order, the foreman, the investors, the sheriff who looked the other way. It took me 2 years. When it was done, I started the ledger. I decided that if the law would not balance the scales, I would. Elara looked down at the photograph again, the little girl with the ribbons. I am sorry, she said, and meant it. Tobias took the frame back, setting it on the shelf with care. Your father knew about them. He was the deputy who investigated the fire. He was the only lawman who tried. We stayed in contact after that. When he found out about your mother, he came to me. We worked together. Brothers in grief, if not in blood. He turned back to her, his eyes fierce. That is why he sent you to me, Elara. Not because I am safe, not because I am good, but because I am the only person left in this territory who gives a damn about the truth. Something shifted in the cabin then. A sound, subtle, the creak of a floorboard that should not have creaked. Tobias's hand went to his knife in an instant. Stay here, he hissed. He moved to the door of the map room, peering out into the main cabin. Elara held her breath, her heart hammering. Then she heard it. A whistle, sharp, high, coming from outside. Tobias's face went white. He threw open the shutters of the map room's single window. An arrow was embedded in the wooden frame, still quivering from impact. Tied to the shaft was a hank of hair, long, blonde, the color of wheat in summer, and a piece of paper folded tight. Tobias ripped it free, read it, and staggered back as if shot. Elara grabbed the paper from his shaking hand. The words were written in a flowing, almost elegant script. The girl lives. Come to the old mission before the full moon alone, or she burns like her mother. Signed, J.C. Elara gazed at the hair, then at Tobias. Who? She asked, though she already knew. Tobias sank into a chair, his face buried in his hands. May, he whispered. My daughter, May. But she is dead. You said they died in the fire. We found 2 bodies, burned beyond recognition. I assumed, I buried them, I mourned them. His voice broke. But there were no bones. Children's bones are small. I should have looked closer. I should have known. He looked up at Elara, his eyes red. Jedediah took her. 10 years ago, he took my daughter, and he has kept her alive all this time, as insurance, as a leash. Elara felt the floor drop out from beneath her. That is why you never came after him. Why his status is pending. If I kill him, she dies. If I go to the law, she dies. He made that very clear in letters over the years. Anonymous, untraceable, but always with proof. A lock of her hair, a drawing she made, enough to let me know she lived, not enough to find her. He stood pacing like a caged animal, and now he is calling in the debt. He wants me at the mission, alone, which means it is a trap, which means he intends to kill me and take this ledger and bury every piece of evidence that could destroy him. Elara looked at the arrow, the hair, the note. Her mind raced. Jedediah had been playing a long game, longer than she had imagined. He had controlled Tobias for a decade with the threat of a child's life. He had murdered her parents for land and gold. He had built an empire on bones and lies. And now he was tying up loose ends. She thought of the wedding she had fled, of Wallace Kern waiting at the altar, of Jedediah's face when he realized she was gone. He would know where she went. He would know why. And he would come. "We have to leave," she said. "Now, if he knows I am here, he will send men. I cannot leave, not until I know May is safe. Then we go to the mission, together." Tobias shook his head. "You heard the message. Alone. If I bring you, he kills her. And if you go alone, he kills you both. You know that. He is not going to let her live. She is a witness. She has seen too much. The moment you are dead, she becomes a liability." Tobias stared at her. She stared back. "My father trusted you," Alara said. "Now I am trusting you. But you have to trust me too. We are stronger together than apart. That is what Jedediah fears. That is why he wants you isolated." Outside, the wind howled. The arrow swayed in the window frame, the blonde hair catching the lamplight. Tobias gazed at the ledger, then at the photograph of Sarah and May, then at Alara. "If we do this," he said slowly, "there is no going back. You will be marked, hunted. Your life in Granite Hollow is over." "My life in Granite Hollow ended the day my father died," Alara said. "I did not come here to go back. I came here for the truth, and for justice." She picked up the Colt Peacemaker from the desk where it lay among the maps. "Teach me to fight. Teach me to survive, and then we will go get your daughter." Tobias studied her for a long moment. Then, for the first time since she had met him, he smiled. It was a hard smile, a wolf's smile. "7 days," he said. "I will give you 7 days to learn what most men take years to master, and then we ride to the mission." He extended his hand. She took it. Outside, the storm began to build again, snow swirling against the windows, the mountain groaning under the weight of winter. But inside the cabin in the map room, surrounded by the names of the dead and the damned 2 people who had lost everything, made a pact. They would face the devil together, or they would die trying. And that was how Alara Vance, 18 years old, daughter of murdered parents, became a student of the Blood Hunter. That was how the ledger gained 2 new names: Jedediah Crouch, status pending; May Thorne, status to be determined. The first stars were appearing through breaks in the clouds when Tobias finally led Alara back to the main cabin. He built up the fire. He made coffee. And then, as they sat across from each other in the flickering light, he began to teach her the things her father had wanted her to know: how to read a map by moonlight, how to track a man through snow, how to tell when someone was lying by the way their eyes moved, how to load a gun in the dark, how to survive when survival seemed impossible. But most importantly, he taught her this: that monsters were not always the ones with scars and rifles. Sometimes they wore fine suits and smiled at funerals. Sometimes they raised you as family while plotting your death. And sometimes the only way to stop them was to become something just as dangerous, just as relentless, just as willing to do what needed to be done. The 7 days that followed would test everything Alara thought she knew about herself. But tonight, the first night, she slept in the bed while Tobias kept watch by the fire. And for the first time since her father's death, she felt something that had been absent for so long she had almost forgotten its name: hope. Dangerous, fragile, sharp-edged, but hope nonetheless. The mountain held its breath. The ledger waited. And somewhere in the darkness, a little girl with blonde hair counted the days until the full moon, not knowing that rescue was coming, not knowing that 2 broken people had decided to make themselves whole by tearing down the world that had destroyed them. The Blood Hunter and the Truth Seeker. The old wolf and the young hawk. Together they would write the final pages of the ledger, and the first name they would cross off would be written in fire and gold and the screams of a man who had thought himself untouchable. But that reckoning was still 7 days away. Tonight there was only the fire and the coffee and the quiet sound of 2 people learning to trust in a world built on lies. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering tracks, erasing the past, making space for what came next. The arrow still hung in the window frame when dawn broke over the iron peaks. Tobias had not moved from his position by the fire. He sat rigid in the rocking chair, staring at the blonde hair that twisted slowly in the draught, catching the pale morning light like spun gold. Elara had slept poorly, waking every hour to the sound of wood cracking in the cold, to the whisper of wind through the eaves, to the terrible silence of a man wrestling with ghosts. Now, as gray light filtered through the frost-etched windows, she rose from the bed and approached him carefully. His face was ash-pale. His hands, those massive hands that could snap a man's neck or dress a wound with equal precision, were trembling. "Tobias," she said softly. He did not respond. His eyes were locked on the arrow, unblinking, seeing something she could not. 10 years of grief. 10 years of believing his daughter was ash and bone buried beneath a marker he had carved himself. 10 years of living with the knowledge that he had failed her. And now this. Proof that she lived. Proof that she had been alive all along, suffering, waiting, believing perhaps that her father had abandoned her. "Tobias?" Elara said again, louder this time. Still nothing. She did something then that surprised them both. She walked to him, knelt beside the rocking chair, and placed her hand over his. The contact seemed to break whatever spell held him. He flinched, his eyes focusing on her face for the first time since the arrow had arrived. "She was 3, he whispered. His voice was raw, scraped clean of everything but pain. 3 years old. She had a doll made of corn husks. She called it Maggie. She would not sleep without it." Elara said nothing. There were no words for this, no platitudes that would not ring hollow. "I should have known," Tobias continued, his voice rising. "I should have checked. I should have torn that cabin apart board by board. I should have counted every bone. But I did not. I buried 2 bodies, and I walked away because I could not bear to look." His hand suddenly clenched into a fist, crushing the wood of the chair arm. The grain splintered under the pressure. "I failed her. She needed me, and I failed her." The chair arm cracked. Tobias stood abruptly, sending the rocker slamming back against the wall. He strode to the fireplace and in one violent motion swept his arm across the mantel. Jars of preserves exploded against the floor. Glass shattered. Pickled beets bled across the wood like wounds. "I failed her," he roared, and the sound was primal, a wounded animal's howl. He grabbed the poker from the fireplace and swung it at the wall. Once, twice, 3 times. Logs splintered, dust rained from the ceiling. Elara stood frozen, watching the blood hunter come apart. He dropped the poker. He sagged against the wall, his forehead pressed to the rough wood, his shoulders heaving. Then he slid down to the floor and covered his face with his hands. For a long moment, the only sound was his ragged breathing and the crackle of the fire consuming itself. Elara moved then, not away, toward. She sat down beside him on the floor among the broken glass and spilled preserves. She did not touch him. She did not speak. She simply sat, her shoulder inches from his, present in his collapse, the way he had been present in hers when she had arrived half-frozen and terrified on his doorstep. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Time lost meaning in the weight of shared grief. Finally, Tobias lowered his hands. His eyes were red-rimmed but dry. He had gone beyond tears. "I am going to the mission," he said. His voice was flat. "Final? Alone? Tonight?" "No," Elara said. "It is not your choice." "Then whose choice is it? The man who sent that arrow? The man who has been playing you like a puppet for 10 years? You will walk into his trap and die, and May will die with you. I cannot risk her life. You already are. The moment you go alone, you guarantee her death. Jedediah does not keep promises. He keeps leverage. May is only valuable as long as you are alive and controlled. Once you are dead, she becomes a witness, a liability. He will kill her. You know this." Tobias turned to look at her, his scarred face haggard. "What would you have me do? Fight smart instead of desperate. We have 7 days until the full moon. Use them. Prepare. Plan. Do not give him what he expects. And if I am wrong, if he kills her when I do not come alone, then at least you will still be alive to make him pay for it." The brutality of her logic hung between them. Tobias studied her face, searching for something, weakness perhaps, or certainty. He found neither. He found only a young woman who had already lost everyone she loved and refused to lose anyone else. 7 days, he said finally. 7 days, she agreed. He pulled himself to his feet, wincing at the stiffness in his joints, the weight of his years suddenly visible. He examined the destruction he had wrought. The broken chair, the shattered jars, the gouges in the wall. "I will clean this," he said. "We will clean it," Hilara corrected. "Together." They worked in silence, sweeping glass, wiping preserves from the floor, righting the furniture. It was domestic, mundane. And somehow, in its ordinariness, it pulled them both back from the edge. When the cabin was restored to order, Tobias retrieved 2 tin mugs and poured coffee from the pot that had survived the chaos. He handed one to Hilara. "If we are doing this," he said, "if we are going after her together, then I need to know you can protect yourself. 7 days is not enough time to make you a soldier, but it is enough time to keep you from getting killed in the first minute. Then teach me." He looked at her over the rim of his mug, his dark eyes calculating. "It will hurt. You will bleed. You will want to quit. I have wanted to quit every day since my father died. I am still here." The ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Then we start now." The training began that morning and did not stop until exhaustion forced them into sleep each night. Tobias was not a gentle teacher. He did not coddle or encourage. He simply demonstrated once, then expected her to replicate. Shooting, tracking, knife work, hand-to-hand combat adapted for someone half his size and strength. By the second day, Hilara's hands were blistered and bleeding from working the action of the Colt. Her shoulders ached from the recoil. Her legs trembled from hours of maintaining shooting stances in the snow. By the third day, she could load the revolver in darkness. She could track a rabbit's prints across 50 yards of broken ground. She could fall without breaking bones and roll back to her feet with a knife ready. By the 5th day, she stopped thinking and started reacting. That was when Tobias knew she would survive. They fell into a rhythm: dawn shooting practice, midday tracking exercises, afternoon combat drills, evening lessons in reading terrain, identifying ambush points, understanding the psychology of violent men. And in the quiet hours between when they sat by the fire drinking coffee or ate meals in companionable silence, something shifted between them. It was subtle. A glance held a moment too long, a hand steadying her elbow when she stumbled in the snow. The way he positioned himself always between her and the door, an unconscious protective instinct. On the 6th evening, after a particularly brutal knife drill that had left her with a shallow cut across her forearm, Tobias cleaned and bandaged the wound with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his size. He sat across from her at the heavy oak table, his rough hands surprisingly deft as he wrapped clean linen around her arm. The firelight cast half his face in shadow, the scar on his cheek standing out like a lightning strike. Hilara watched his face as he worked. The concentration, the care. When he tied off the bandage, his fingers lingered for just a heartbeat longer than necessary. Their eyes met. Neither spoke. The moment stretched taut, as a drawn bowstring, heavy with things neither knew how to name. Then Tobias pulled away, clearing his throat, returning to his habitual distance. But Hilara had felt it. The crack in his armor, the recognition that she was not just a responsibility or a promise to a dead friend. She was becoming something more dangerous than that. She was becoming someone he could not afford to lose. The 7th day dawned cold and clear. The full moon was tomorrow night. They would ride for the mission at dusk. Hilara woke to find Tobias already gone from the cabin. She dressed quickly, pulled on her boots, and went searching. She found him in a small lean-to behind the cabin, a structure she had not noticed before. Inside, among tools and supplies, was a trunk. Tobias knelt before it, the lid open, staring at the contents. Hilara approached quietly. Over his shoulder she could see what held his attention: a woman's dress, carefully folded, a child's shoes impossibly small, and a book bound in cracked leather, its pages yellowed with age. "Sarah's things," Tobias said without turning. "I could not burn them. I told myself I would, but I never did." He reached in and withdrew the book, handling it like something sacred. Her diary. She wrote in it every night. About the garden, about May's first words, about me. His voice caught, about how happy she was. He held it out to Alara. "Read it. If you are going to risk your life for my daughter, you should know who her mother was." Alara took the diary carefully and opened to a random page. The handwriting was elegant looping. May 14th, 1876. Tobias built May a swing today, hanging from the big pine near the creek. She laughed so hard she got the hiccups. I have never seen him smile the way he smiled watching her. He is a hard man with a soft heart. I am blessed. Alara turned pages reading fragments. Recipes, weather observations, tender notes about domestic life. Then she found an entry that made her breath catch. September 3rd, 1871. A young woman arrived at our door today, half-starved and heavy with child. Shoshone barely 18, desperate. She says her name is Aida Running Deer. She says her sister disappeared 2 years ago, taken by white men who wanted their land. She has been searching ever since. She has nowhere else to go. I told Tobias we must help her. He agreed without hesitation. We have made room in the cabin. The baby will come soon. Alara's hands shook. September 30th, 1871. Aida gave birth to a daughter this morning. A difficult labor, but both survived. The baby is beautiful with her mother's dark hair and eyes that might lighten to blue. Aida named her Alara after a star. She wept when she held her. I wept too. To witness such love, such fierce protection, is humbling. The words blurred as tears filled Alara's eyes. November 1871. A man came today, a prospector named Henry Vance. He knew Aida from town, had been searching for her. The way they examined each other, I knew this was no casual acquaintance. He asked her to marry him. She said yes. They will leave in the spring. I am happy for her, but I will miss her presence. She has become like a sister to me. Alara looked up at Tobias. My mother was here, in this cabin. You knew her. I did. She stayed with us for 6 months. Sarah loved her. When she left with your father, Sarah made her promise to write. She did for a few years. Then the letters stopped. We assumed she had moved on, started her new life. We did not know she had died. Until my father told you? Yes. When Henry came to me about the investigation into the fire, he told me about Aida, about you. He asked me to watch over you if anything happened to him. He said you were all that remained of a woman who had been kind to us when she had nothing. He took the diary back gently. So, you see, Alara, you are not a stranger I saved in a storm. You are the daughter of someone Sarah cared for. That makes you family, and I protect family. The word hung in the air between them. Family. A thing both had lost, a thing both feared to claim again. Before Alara could respond, a sound cut through the morning air. Hoofbeats. Tobias was on his feet instantly, his hand going to the rifle leaning against the lean-to wall. Inside, he commanded. Now. They ran to the cabin. Tobias barred the door and moved to a peephole in the shutters, his rifle ready. The rider came into view. A single horse rider slumped in the saddle, moving erratically. He is injured, Tobias muttered. The horse stopped 20 yards from the cabin. The rider tried to dismount and fell instead, collapsing into the snow. Tobias tensed, scanning the tree line for an ambush. Could be a trap. But the rider was not moving. Blood stained the snow around him. I am going out, Tobias said. Not alone. He looked at her, started to argue, then nodded. Stay behind me. If I signal, you run back inside and bar the door. They moved out cautiously, weapons ready. As they approached the fallen rider, Alara recognized the horse. That is Billy Miller's mare. Tobias reached the body and rolled it over. Billy's face was gray with blood loss. His shirt was soaked red from a wound in his side. His eyes fluttered open. Alara, he gasped, you are alive, thank God. What happened? She knelt beside him, pressing her hands to the wound to slow the bleeding. Trap, Billy wheezed. Your uncle. He knows you're here. Hired men. 12 of them. Coming for the cabin. When? Tonight. Dusk. Billy's hand grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. But that is not the worst. May, the girl, she is not at the mission. Tobias went rigid. What did you say? The mission is empty. A decoy. I heard Jedediah talking to his men. The girl is hidden at the old mine, the one beneath this ridge. Billy coughed, blood flecking his lips. My sister, Lucy. He has her too. forced me to ride with his men. I could not. I tried to warn you." His eyes were pleading. "I am sorry, Alara, for everything. I should have been braver." "You are being brave now," she said, tears streaming down her face. Billy smiled weakly. "Tell Lucy I love her. Tell her I tried." His eyes lost focus. His hand went slack. Billy Miller died in the snow outside the blood hunter's cabin, 20 years old, having finally found the courage he thought he lacked. Alara closed his eyes gently. Tobias stood over them, his face carved from stone. He was telling the truth. Yes, Billy was not a liar, just weak, and Jedediah knew exactly how to use that. Tobias looked toward the mountain, toward the mine shafts that honeycombed the rock beneath his land. If May is in the mine and the mercenaries attack the cabin tonight, then this was always a chess game. Split us. Force us to choose between defending the ledger and saving May. While we fight his hired guns, Jedediah goes into the mine and either kills her or moves her somewhere we will never find her. Alara stood, her mind racing through possibilities. Unless we do not give him the choice he expects. What are you proposing? You said there is a mine entrance inside your cabin, the trapdoor beneath the pantry. Yes, it leads to the old shaft, but it is unstable, dangerous. More dangerous than 12 hired killers. Tobias considered this. If we go into the mine, we abandon the cabin. They will burn it. The ledger. I can copy it. The important pages. We hide copies in multiple places. Even if they burn the original, the evidence survives. That will take hours. Then we start now. They worked with furious efficiency. Alara sat at the desk in the map room, copying names, crimes confessions. Her hand cramped. Her eyes burned. But she did not stop. Tobias prepared supplies, food, water, ammunition, lanterns, dynamite from his stores. By mid-afternoon, they had 3 complete copies of the critical ledger pages, one sealed in oilcloth and hidden in the mine, one buried in a tin box near the creek, one given to Billy's horse with instructions if the animal returned to town, someone might find it. As the sun began its descent toward the peaks, they stood together in the cabin one last time. Tobias looked at the walls he had built with his own hands, the fireplace where Sarah had cooked meals, the floor where May had taken her first steps. "I will burn it myself before I let them have it," he said quietly. "Then let us make sure there is nothing left for them to find." They moved the barrels in the pantry. Tobias unlocked the trapdoor. The smell of earth and stone rose to meet them. "Once we go down, there is no coming back this way. The mine is a maze. We could get lost. We could get trapped. Or we could find your daughter." Tobias looked at her, this young woman who had walked into his life a week ago and somehow become the only person in 10 years he trusted completely. "If we do not survive this, we will. But if we do not, I want you to know something." He reached out and took her hand. The contact was electric. "Your father was right to send you to me, not because I could protect you, but because you could save me from becoming something I was not sure I could come back from." Alara squeezed his hand. "Then let us save each other." They descended into darkness. The mine swallowed them whole, the trapdoor closing above with a finality that sounded like a coffin lid. Tobias lit a lantern. The light pushed back shadows but created new ones, stretching and distorting. The tunnel sloped downward, rough-hewn rock walls, glistening with moisture. Their breath formed clouds. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, a metronome counting time. They walked for what felt like hours, but was probably 20 minutes, descending deeper into the mountain's heart. The tunnel branched. Tobias chose paths with the certainty of someone who had mapped every inch of these passages. And then the tunnel opened into a cavern. Alara raised her lantern and gasped. The walls glittered with veins of gold. Not dust, not flakes. Thick seams running through the granite like frozen lightning. The wealth here was staggering. Generational. Empire building. "Now you see why men kill for this land," Tobias said. But it was not the gold that held Alara's attention. It was the chamber at the far end of the cavern, a natural alcove deliberately walled off with stacked stones, and in front of those stones scattered bones, human bones. Alara approached slowly. There were at least 6 skeletons, some still partially clothed in rotted fabric. Prospector's gear, rusted tools, and one skeleton smaller than the rest, adorned with jewelry. Shoshone jewelry. Alara knelt beside it, her hand trembling as she reached for the necklace still draped across the collapsed ribcage. It was identical to the one she wore, the one her mother had given her. "Two sisters," she whispered. "My mother and her sister, they both had these necklaces." Tobias knelt beside her, examining the remains. "Look at the ribcage." Alara looked closer. There, tattooed into the bone itself, preserved by some miracle of mineral deposit and dry air, was a pattern. Not random. Deliberate. A map. "Your aunt did not just discover gold," Tobias said slowly. "She documented it, on her own body, where no one could steal it unless they killed her. And they did kill her. Yes, but I suspect they did not find what they were looking for. Jedediah must have searched for years, wondering where she hid the map. Never knowing it was written on her skin, Alara felt rage bubble up inside her. Cold. Clarifying. "My mother came looking for her sister. Found you and Sarah instead. Met my father. Started to build a life, but she must have kept searching. And when she got pregnant, when she was vulnerable, she must have found something. Evidence. Proof. And Jedediah silenced her the same way he silenced her sister. Two women who stood in his way. Two women he erased." Alara stood, her jaw set. "I will not be the third." A sound echoed through the cavern then, distant but distinct. Voices. Tobias extinguished the lantern instantly. They crouched in darkness listening. The voices grew louder, multiple men, moving through the tunnels with the confidence of people following a guide. "They are here," Tobias breathed. "In the mine. They must have entered from the main shaft on the eastern slope. How many? At least 4, maybe more. Then they split their forces. Some at the cabin, some here. And somewhere in this warren of tunnels is May." They moved deeper into the cavern, away from the voices, into a side passage Tobias indicated with a gesture. This tunnel was narrower, older the walls, slick with condensation. And then Alara heard it. Singing. Faint. Ethereal. A child's voice echoing through stone. The same Shoshone lullaby Alara had sung that first night. The song her mother had taught her. The song Sarah had known. Tobias froze. "May," he whispered. They followed the sound, moving as quickly as they dared in the darkness. The singing grew louder, clearer, leading them through twists and turns until the tunnel opened into another chamber. This one had been modified. Someone had brought supplies, blankets, food stores, a small stove. And in the center, sitting on a pallet, was a girl. She was perhaps 13, thin and pale from lack of sun, with blonde hair that fell past her shoulders and eyes that were Tobias's eyes, dark and intelligent and haunted. She stopped singing when the lantern light found her. For a moment, father and daughter stared at each other across 10 years of absence. Then May spoke, her voice small and uncertain. "Papa." Tobias's rifle clattered to the ground. He crossed the chamber in 3 strides and fell to his knees before her. "May, my May, you are alive!" The girl reached out a trembling hand and touched his face, tracing the scar as if checking that he was real. "They said you were dead. Uncle Jedediah said you died in the fire with Mama. He said he saved me. He said I should be grateful." "He lied, sweetheart. He lied about everything." May's face crumpled, years of confusion and grief finally given permission to surface. "I knew," she sobbed. "Part of me always knew, because you would not have left me. You would not." Tobias pulled her into his arms. This child he had mourned, this daughter stolen and hidden, and weaponized against him. He held her as she wept his own tears, falling silent into her hair. Alara watched from the tunnel entrance, her heart breaking and mending simultaneously. This was what they had come for. This was what mattered more than gold or revenge or justice. This. But the moment shattered as a new voice cut through the chamber. How touching. Jedediah Crouch stepped from a side passage, flanked by 2 armed men. He was dressed immaculately, despite the rough surroundings. His mustache waxed his eyes cold and calculating. "The prodigal father returns. 10 years too late, Thorne. But then you always were slow on the uptake." Tobias rose slowly, positioning himself between May and Jedediah, his hand moving toward the knife at his belt. "Do not," Jedediah said pleasantly. "My associates have rifles. You have sentiment." The math does not favor you. Let her go, Crouch. Your quarrel is with me. Oh, but it is not a quarrel at all. It is business. You have something I want. The ledger. I have something you want. Your daughter. A simple trade. The ledger burned with the cabin. Jedediah smiled. Did it? How careless of you. Though I suspect copies exist, you are nothing if not thorough. His eyes slid to Alara. And you brought Henry's girl. How delightfully symmetrical. 3 orphans in a cave about to learn that family is a liability in this world. You killed my parents, Alara said. Her voice was steady, cold. I did what was necessary. Your aunt was stubborn. Your mother was nosy. Your father was righteous. All fatal flaws in a place where only the practical survive. He gestured to his men. Take the girl. Kill Thorne. We will discuss Miss Vance's future topside. The men raised their rifles, and the world exploded. Tobias had pulled May behind him and dove for his own rifle in one fluid motion, firing before he hit the ground. The first mercenary went down his chest, erupting red. Alara drew the Colt and fired twice, her hands steady, her aim true. 7 days of training compressed into instinct. The second mercenary fell. Jedediah scrambled back into his tunnel, screaming orders. More coming! Move! Tobias grabbed May's hand and Alara's arm. Run! They plunged into a different passage, one that Tobias knew led deeper into the mountain toward the Devil's Throat, the old ventilation shaft that emerged near the waterfall. Behind them, voices shouted. Boots pounded stone. Shots echoed bullets sparking off walls. The mine became a labyrinth of terror. They ran through passages barely wide enough for Tobias's shoulders. They slid down shale slopes. They waded through knee-deep water that burned with cold. And always the voices followed. But Tobias knew these tunnels. He had spent 10 years mapping them, fortifying them, preparing for a siege that he had always known would come. They emerged finally into a natural chimney, a vertical shaft with rough handholds carved into the rock. Moonlight streamed from above. Climb, Tobias commanded. May 1st. Then Alara. I will cover our retreat. May began to climb with the agility of youth. Alara followed her muscles, screaming, her hands raw. Below, Tobias pulled dynamite from his pack, lit the fuse, and threw it back into the tunnel they had just exited. The explosion was catastrophic. The tunnel collapsed, sealing their pursuit. Then he climbed. They emerged on a narrow ledge overlooking the valley. The waterfall roared beside them, mist freezing on their skin. Below, miles below Granite Hollow, was a scatter of lights. And above, riding the switchback trail with torches, came more riders. Jedediah had not put all his pieces in the mine. They were surrounded. Tobias looked at the 2 young women with him. His daughter found after a decade, Alara, who had become something precious in a week. And he made a decision. There is a path, he said, pointing along the cliff face. Narrow, treacherous, it leads to the far ridge. From there you can reach the federal marshal in Cheyenne. We go together, Alara said. No, I end this here, tonight. I will hold them at this pass. You take May and you run. Papa, no, May cried. May, listen to me. I found you. That is all that matters. But Alara knows the truth. She has the evidence. She can make sure Jedediah pays. You have to trust her. He looked at Alara. Protect her, please. Alara looked at this man who had saved her, taught her, trusted her, who had become in such a short time the closest thing to family she had left. She could not leave him, but she could not doom May either. The ledger's final page would be written in blood and choice and impossible decisions. And somewhere in the darkness, Jedediah Crouch was closing in, believing he had already won. But he had made one critical mistake. He had underestimated what desperate people become when they have nothing left to lose. Alara looked at Tobias, standing on that frozen ledge with the waterfall roaring beside him and the torches of their enemies climbing toward them through the darkness, and she understood with perfect clarity that this was the moment when everything could be lost. The old way would be for him to sacrifice himself, the hero making the noble stand while the women flee to safety, the blood hunter writing his final entry in red across the snow. But Alara Vance had not walked into a blizzard, had not learned to kill, had not copied a ledger of the dead in order to watch another person she cared about die for her. No, she said, Tobias turned to her, surprise flickering across his scarred face. Alara, there is no time to argue. They will be here in minutes. Then we do not waste time arguing. We do something they will not expect. She looked at May, shivering in her thin dress, this ghost child pulled from a decade of captivity. Then she looked back at Tobias. You said the cabin burned. You said the ledger was in the cabin. What did you not tell Jedediah? Tobias's eyes narrowed, following her logic. That we copied it. That we hid the copies. Exactly. He thinks the evidence is destroyed. He thinks he has won. So why is he still chasing us? May spoke then, her voice small but clear in the roar of the waterfall. Because I am still alive. I know things. I have seen things. Both adults looked at her. What kind of things? Alara asked gently. May's face was pale, but her eyes were steady, older than her years. Where the bodies are buried. The real ones. The prospectors who came asking questions. The native families who would not sell their land. Uncle Jedediah used to take me with him sometimes when I was little. Before I understood what I was seeing, he said it was important that I learn how the world really worked. Horror settled over Alara like a shroud. Jedediah had not just kept May alive as a hostage. He had been grooming her, showing her his empire of bones, making her complicit so that even if she escaped, she would be too guilty to speak. It was monstrous. Then May is the real ledger, Tobias said quietly. A living witness to crimes that go beyond what I documented. Which means he will never stop hunting her, ever, unless we give him a reason to think she is already dead. The plan formed between them in glances and half-words, the way ideas crystallize between people who have learned to think as one unit. The cliff path, Alara said. How stable is it? Stable enough for one person at a time, maybe two if they're careful, in daylight. And in darkness, in a storm. Tobias looked at the sky. Clouds were rolling in from the west, heavy and black, promising snow. Suicide. Why, because we make them think we tried it, that we fell. They find bodies at the bottom of the gorge broken on the rocks. The blood hunter, his daughter, and the girl from town. All dead. Case closed. Jedediah wins. But we do not give him bodies. We give him evidence of bodies. Torn clothes, blood in the snow, a fall no one could survive. Where do we actually go? Alara pointed toward the mine entrance they had just climbed from. Back down, into the deepest parts of the mine, the parts Jedediah does not know about. We hide. We wait. And when he thinks we are dead, when he pulls his men back, we emerge. We make our way to Cheyenne. We deliver May to the federal marshal, along with the ledger copies. May looked between them, her face a mixture of hope and terror. Will it work? It has to, Alara said. Tobias was already moving, his tactical mind engaged despite the wound in his shoulder that had reopened during the climb. He pulled May's outer shawl off and tore it into strips. He smeared some with his own blood from the shoulder wound. He scattered the pieces along the cliff path as if they had been ripped away during a desperate flight. Alara did the same with her own shawl, adding more blood from a deliberate cut on her palm, wincing but not hesitating. Then Tobias took his distinctive hat, the wide-brimmed one that every person in the territory would recognize, and threw it over the edge. It tumbled end over end into the darkness, disappearing into the mist and spray of the waterfall. They will search, he said, at dawn. They will find these signs, and they will assume we tried the cliff path at night and fell. And we give them no reason to doubt it. They descended back into the mine, sealing the entrance behind them with a rockfall that looked natural but was carefully constructed to be reopened from inside. Then they went deeper than they had gone before, into passages that smelled of sulfur and ancient water, into the buried heart of the mountain where no light had ever reached except what they brought with them. They found a chamber with a natural spring-clear water bubbling from a crack in the rock. Tobias had stored emergency supplies here years ago, sealed in waterproof containers, hardtack, dried meat, blankets, ammunition. We may need to stay down here for days, he said, distributing the supplies. Maybe a week, until we are certain they have stopped looking. Then we stay, Alara said. May sat on a flat rock, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of water, staring at nothing. The shock was settling in. 10 years of her life built on lies. The man she had called uncle revealed as a murderer and a monster. The father, she had been told, was dead, alive, and bleeding in front of her. Alara sat down beside her. "How are you holding up?" May looked at her with eyes that had seen far too much. "I do not know what I am supposed to feel. Relief that Papa is alive. Horror at what Uncle Jedediah is. Guilt that I believed him, that I lived in his house and ate his food and called him family. You were a child. You survived the only way you could. That is not guilt. That is strength. But I should have known. There were signs, things that did not make sense. I just did not want to see them." Alara thought of Billy, of the boy who had been too weak to stand against evil until the very end. Of how easy it was to judge courage when you were not the one being asked to sacrifice everything. "A boy died yesterday trying to warn us about you," Alara said quietly. "His name was Billy Miller. He was not brave his whole life, but he was brave when it mattered. That is all any of us can be." May looked up. "Billy, the deputy's son, with the sandy hair. You knew him. He used to sneak me candy. When Uncle Jedediah brought me to town, Billy would find me and slip me peppermints. He never asked questions. He just smiled and made me feel like maybe the world was not all darkness." Tears spilled down May's cheeks. "He was the only kind person in that whole town. And now he is dead because of me." "No, because of Jedediah. Billy made his choice. He chose to be brave, to tell the truth. That is a gift, May. The truth he gave us is what saved you." Across the chamber, Tobias was checking his weapons, his movements mechanical, his face distant. He had not spoken to May beyond the initial reunion, not because he did not want to, because he did not know how. What did you say to a daughter stolen from you? How did you bridge a decade of absence? How did you tell a child that you had mourned them, buried them, carried their death inside you like a stone, only to discover they had been alive, all along, suffering, waiting, perhaps thinking you had abandoned them? Alara stood and walked to him. "Talk to her." "I do not know what to say." "Start with the truth. Tell her what happened the day of the fire. Tell her about Sarah. Tell her that you never stopped looking, even when you thought there was nothing left to find." Tobias looked at his daughter across the firelight. "What if she hates me? What if she cannot forgive me for not finding her sooner? Then you will live with that, but you will live with it together. That is more than either of you had yesterday." Alara left them, then moving to the far side of the chamber to give them privacy. She heard the low rumble of Tobias's voice, the soft responses from May. She did not listen to the words. Some conversations were sacred. She sat with her back against the stone wall, the Colt in her lap, and allowed herself to feel the weight of the last 8 days. 8 days ago, she had been a girl playing at investigation, thinking she could simply find answers and return to some version of normal life. Now she was a woman with blood on her hands and a price on her head, sitting in a cave beneath a mountain, waiting to see if a desperate gambit would save 3 lives or doom them. She thought of her father, of the letter he had written knowing he would die. Had he imagined this? Had he known that sending her to Tobias would transform her into something sharp and dangerous? Or had he simply hoped she would survive long enough to learn the truth? Either way, she was here, changed, hardened, but somehow impossibly not broken. She must have dozed because she woke to the sound of voices above, distant, muffled by layers of rock, but unmistakably human. Tobias was at her side instantly, his hand over her mouth to keep her silent. May was already awake, pressed against the far wall, eyes wide. They listened. The voices faded, came back, faded again. Searchers, combing the mountain. For 3 days the voices came and went, sometimes close enough that they could hear individual words, curses, complaints about the cold, speculation about whether the bodies had been washed away by the river at the base of the falls. On the 4th day, the voices stopped. On the 5th day, they risked a small fire to cook food and warm themselves against the bone-deep chill of the deep earth. On the 6th day, Tobias climbed up to the sealed entrance and listened. Silence. He carefully moved 1 rock. 2. Peered out into the night. Empty. He returned to the chamber. They are gone. Pulled back to town. Either they believe we are dead or they have decided to wait us out at lower altitude. Then we leave tonight, Alara said. They packed what little they had. The copies of the ledger sealed in oilcloth, the weapons, a few days of food and water. Then they began the long climb back to the surface, moving like ghosts through the passages, following routes that Tobias had mapped in his years of solitude. They emerged not at the cabin, but at a hidden exit near the tree line, a mile from where the searchers had focused their efforts. The night was clear and cold stars, thick as spilled salt across the black sky. The cabin was gone, burned to its foundation, just as Tobias had predicted. Only the stone chimney remained a skeletal finger pointing at the sky. They did not stop to mourn it. They moved quickly through the forest, heading east away from Granite Hollow toward the territorial road that would take them to Cheyenne. They traveled at night and hid during the day, sleeping in turns, always watching the back trail for pursuit that never came. On the third night of travel, they stopped at an abandoned homestead, a soddy half-collapsed, but offering shelter from the wind. Tobias built a small fire in the crude hearth, while May and Alara sorted through their supplies. It was there in the flickering firelight that May finally spoke the truth she had been carrying. "I need to tell you something about Uncle Jedediah, about the last 10 years. Tobias and Alara both turned to look at her. May's hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. "He did not keep me locked up, not after the first few months. He gave me a room in his house, a good room. He bought me dresses. He sent me to school with the other children, though I used a different name. Mary Crouch, his niece from back east." Tobias went very still. "You lived in Granite Hollow all this time." Ilara's mind raced back to the mine chamber where they had found May. "But we found you in the mine. You were there with supplies as if you had been there for weeks." May's face darkened. 3 days. I had been there 3 days when you found me. When your wedding was announced, when Uncle Jedediah realized you had run away, he panicked. He knew you would come to the mountain. He knew Papa would help you. So he moved me from the house in the middle of the night, said it was for my protection, said there were dangerous people coming." She laughed bitterly. "I did not know I was the bait. I thought he was protecting me. Even then, even after everything, part of me still believed he cared. Yes, I walked the same streets as you, Papa, on the days you came to trade. I saw you once from a distance. You did not recognize me. I had grown, changed, and I was too afraid to run to you because Uncle Jedediah said, if I ever spoke to you, if I ever told anyone who I really was, he would kill you. He showed me his men. He showed me what they did to people who crossed him. I believed him." Tears streamed down her face. "I am sorry, Papa. I was a coward. I could have run. I could have screamed for help. But I did not. I just lived his life and wore his name and pretended everything was fine." Tobias crossed to her and knelt, taking her hands. "May, listen to me. You were 8 years old when he took you. You survived. That is all that matters. You did what you had to do to stay alive. There is no shame in that. But I could have ended it. I could have told someone. And you would have died. Jedediah would have made sure of it. You stayed alive. You waited. And when Billy gave you the truth, when he told you that I was still hunting for you, you made your choice then. You are here now. That is what counts." May collapsed against him, sobbing, and Tobias held her the way he should have been able to hold her for the last 10 years. Alara turned away, giving them this moment, blinking back her own tears. When the storm of emotion had passed, May pulled back, wiping her eyes. "There is more, things I overheard. Uncle Jedediah was planning something big. He has partners, men in Denver, men in Washington. They want to turn this whole territory into a mining empire. They need the land clear. No natives, no stubborn homesteaders, no one who might object or claim prior ownership. An organized land grab," Tobias said grimly. "Yes. And the ledger, Papa's ledger, it was the one thing that scared him. Because it documented too many connections, too many murders that could be traced back to him if anyone ever looked close enough. That is why he needed it destroyed. And everyone who knew about it dead." May nodded. "But there is something else. Something I think he does not know I know. There is a lawyer in Cheyenne, Silas Whitmore. He holds documents, deeds, insurance papers. I heard Uncle Jedediah talking about him, once saying Whitmore was a problem but could not be touched because he had already filed everything with the territorial court. If anything happened to Whitmore, the documents would go to the federal marshal automatically." Alara leaned forward. "What kind of documents? I do not know exactly, but I think they prove ownership, real ownership, of the land Uncle Jedediah claims is his. including your father's land, Elara. And the land where the gold is, hope flared in Elara's chest. If we can get to Whitmore before Jedediah knows we are alive, if we can secure those documents, we do not just survive, Tobias finished. We win. They reached Cheyenne 4 days later, haggard and filthy, but alive. The city was a sprawl of wood and brick railroad tracks, cutting through its heart, the smell of coal smoke and opportunity thick in the air. They found Silas Whitmore in an office above a dry goods store, a thin man with wire spectacles and ink-stained fingers. When Tobias introduced himself and May, when Elara produced the ledger copies and began to explain, Whitmore listened with the intensity of a man who had been waiting for this conversation. "I knew Henry Vance," he said when she finished. "A good man, an honest man. He came to me 2 years ago with evidence of fraud in the land office. We had been building a case. Quietly, carefully. And then he died." "He was murdered," Elara said. "I suspected as much, but I had no proof. Now you bring me this." He gestured to the ledger pages spread across his desk. "This is enough to hang Jedediah Crouch 10 times over. But we need to move carefully. He has friends in territorial government. If we move too soon, if we give him warning, he will disappear and take his money with him." "What do you suggest?" Tobias asked. "Federal court. We bypass the territorial system entirely. I have contacts, men I trust. We present this evidence directly to a federal circuit judge. We get arrest warrants issued, and we move fast." It took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of depositions and statements and examinations of evidence. 3 weeks of living in a boarding house under false names, watching over their shoulders for assassins who never came. And then the warrants were issued. Federal marshals rode to Granite Hollow with orders to arrest Jedediah Crouch and a list of his associates on charges of murder, fraud, conspiracy, and crimes against the territorial government. Tobias, Elara, and May were not there to see it. They had been advised to stay in Cheyenne for their own safety. But the newspapers brought the story. Mayor arrested in frontier land. Fraud scheme. Crouch and associates face federal charges. Bloodhunter's Ledger provides evidence. The articles were sensational, full of lurid details about the ledger of the dead, the mountain hermit turned vigilante, the brave young woman who had risked everything to expose corruption. They did not tell the whole truth. They never did, but they told enough. Jedediah Crouch was found guilty on 12 counts of murder and conspiracy. He was hanged in the federal prison in Laramie on a cold morning in March of 1890. Elara did not attend, neither did Tobias or May. They were already gone. 6 months after emerging from the mine, Elara stood in front of a new cabin on the ridge where the old one had burned. This structure was larger built, with fresh timber designed for 3 people instead of 1. The spring sun was warm on her face. Wildflowers dotted the meadow. Below the waterfall roared its eternal song. May was inside her nose in a book Elara had bought her in Cheyenne, learning to read properly for the first time in her life. Her laughter drifted through the open window light and real. Tobias was at the woodpile, splitting logs with methodical precision, his shirt off despite the lingering chill, the scar on his shoulder where Elara had stitched him up, now healed to a puckered line. He looked up and caught her watching. Smiled. Not the wolf smile of the blood hunter, just a man's smile. Tired, peaceful. She smiled back. The territory had granted them ownership of the land. Henry Vance's claim validated by Silas Whitmore's documents. The gold was theirs. More wealth than they could spend in 10 lifetimes. They had not touched it. The mine entrance was sealed. The gold could wait. They were building something else now, something more valuable, a life. Elara walked to a spot near the tree line where 3 graves lay side by side, wooden markers carved with care. Sarah Thorne, beloved wife and mother. Aida Running Deer Vance, beloved mother and sister. And a third marker newer than the others, nameless. The sister whose name had been lost, but whose body Tobias had carried from the mine and buried with honors beside the woman she had died trying to protect. Elara placed wildflowers on each grave, purple lupine and Indian paintbrush. She stood for a moment in silence, feeling the mountain breathe around her. "I kept my promise, Papa," she said softly. "I found the truth. I finished what you started. I hope that wherever you are, you know that." Behind her, footsteps approached. Tobias's hand settled gently on her shoulder. "He knows," Tobias said, "and he would be proud." They stood together as the sun climbed higher, warming the world, melting the last of the winter snow. May called from the cabin, asking if they wanted lunch. "Coming," Elora called back. As they walked toward the cabin, toward the life they were building from the ruins of the old Elora, thought about the ledger. It sat in a safe in Silas Whitmore's office now, an official document in federal custody. The names within had been cross-referenced, investigated. Some men had been arrested. Some had fled. Some had simply disappeared into the vastness of the frontier, hoping to outrun their sins. But the ledger was closed now, the last page written, or so they thought. In a hotel in Denver, 300 miles south, a man sat reading the newspaper accounts of Jedediah Crouch's trial and execution. He was well-dressed, clean-shaven, unremarkable in every way except for his eyes, which were the color of winter ice and held the patience of a predator. He folded the paper carefully and set it aside. On the table in front of him lay another ledger, newer, thicker, filled with names and crimes and meticulous notes. One name was circled in red ink, Tobias Thorne. The man opened a leather case and withdrew a pen. In the margin next to Thorne's name he wrote a single word, located. Then he closed the ledger, placed it in his traveling case, and stood to look out the window at the mountains in the distance. "Justice or murder, Thorne," he murmured to himself. "Let us find out which you truly dealt." He put on his hat, picked up his case, and walked out of the hotel room, leaving the newspaper behind. The headline about the blood hunter's ledger faced up on the table, proclaiming the end of a criminal empire. But some stories do not end. They merely pause between chapters. And in the mountains of Wyoming, in a cabin built on bones and gold and hard-won peace, 3 people who had survived the impossible began their fragile experiment in healing. They did not know that new shadows were gathering. They did not know that the ledger, for all its completeness, had missed one name. The name of the man who had trained Jedediah Crouch, who had built the template for land fraud and murder that Crouch had merely copied. The architect behind the empire. And he was very interested in meeting the people who had torn down his protégé's work. But that was a problem for another day. For now, there was lunch. There was laughter. There was May learning to shoot under Tobias's patient instruction. There was Elora teaching the girl the songs her mother had taught her, keeping alive a language and a heritage that men had tried to erase. There was morning coffee on the porch, watching the sun paint the peaks gold. There were evenings by the fire, reading aloud from books, 3 voices taking turns with the words. There were nightmares still, ghosts that visited in darkness. But there were also hands to hold in the night, voices to whisper that you were safe, that you were not alone, that the worst was over. Some wounds heal, some never do. But all can be survived if you have people who refuse to let you face them alone. The mountain stood eternal, indifferent to human drama, holding its gold and its secrets with equal silence. The waterfall roared, the seasons turned, and 3 people who had been broken by the same man's greed learned slowly, painfully, beautifully, how to be whole again. Not by forgetting, but by remembering together, by speaking the names of the dead, by honoring the debts that could never be repaid except through living fully, fiercely, with intention and purpose. Elora Vance became Elora Thorne in a ceremony witnessed by May and Silas Whitmore in the spring of 1891. Not because she needed a man to complete her, but because she had found a partner who understood that strength and tenderness were not opposites, but complements. May grew into a young woman of formidable intelligence and quiet strength, studying law, with Whitmore determined to use the legal system to protect others the way it had failed to protect her family. Tobias laid down his rifle eventually. The ledger was given to the federal archives. The blood hunter became simply a father, a husband, a man who had once done terrible things in service of an impossible justice and now sought to build something better. They did not live happily ever after. That is not how life works. They lived carefully, gratefully. With full knowledge that peace is not permanent, that darkness always waits at the edges, that vigilance is the price of safety. But they lived, and that in the end was victory enough. The ledger of blood and gold was closed, but the story of the people it had bound together, the family forged in fire and loss and desperate hope, that story continued. One day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of courage or kindness or stubborn refusal to give up. That was the real ledger, not the accounting of deaths. But the recording of lives lived despite everything, in defiance of everything, because of everything that had tried to destroy them. And somewhere in whatever place the dead go, Henry Vance and Aida and Sarah and Billy and all the others whose names filled those pages looked down and saw what had been built from the ruins they left behind. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The mountain held its peace, the ledger held its silence, and the family on the ridge held each other. That is where this chapter ends. But as the man in Denver sharpened his knives and studied his maps and planned his approach to the mountain where the blood hunter had finally found rest, another chapter was beginning. One that would test whether the peace they had built was strong enough to withstand the storms that were coming. One that would ask whether justice once begun can ever truly be finished. One that would determine if the sins of the past could be laid to rest, or if they would rise again hungry and relentless, demanding their due. But those are questions for another time, another story, another ledger waiting to be written. For now, there is only this: 3 people, 1 mountain, and the hard-won knowledge that survival is not the end of the story. It is only the beginning.